At 67 years old, I sat in that sweltering car outside Bellingham Country Club for 4 hours while my family enjoyed their lavish anniversary dinner, without me. They said there wasn't enough room at the table for just the driver. That's what my own son Archie Nelson called me that night, while his wife Iris Kelly laughed and my daughter Sadie Rogers nodded in agreement. After 40 years of sacrificing everything for this family, working 3 jobs to put them through college, paying for their weddings, and bailing them out of every financial mess, they left me sitting in a parking lot like hired help. But what they didn't know was that I had been planning something for months, something that would change everything. When they found out I had quietly transferred my entire $2.3 million inheritance to charity and left them absolutely nothing, their tune changed real quick. They went from treating me like the family servant to begging on my doorstep. But by then, it was far too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment I threw my car keys across the attorney's office and declared, "Transfer it all, every last penny to the Children's Hospital Foundation," the silence was deafening. My lawyer, Eleanor Price, stared at me with wide eyes, her pen frozen mid-signature above the inheritance documents that would have made my ungrateful family millionaires. But I was done. Absolutely done. "Mrs. Wood," she said carefully, adjusting her glasses, "are you absolutely certain about this decision? This is your late husband's entire estate we're talking about. $2.3 million. Your children have been expecting..." "Expecting?" I interrupted, my voice sharp as winter wind. "Let me tell you what they've been expecting, Eleanor. They've been expecting me to drive them around like a personal chauffeur, wait in parking lots for hours, and smile, while they treat me like hired help. Well, their expectations just got a reality check." I had walked into Thornfield and Associates law firm that Tuesday morning with a clear mission. My husband, Jesse Morgan, had passed away 8 months prior, leaving behind a substantial inheritance that he'd always intended for our children. But Jesse never lived to see how those children would treat his widow. He never witnessed the slow, systematic degradation of my dignity at the hands of the people I'd raised and loved unconditionally. The decision hadn't come overnight. It had been building for months, like pressure in a kettle, until that humiliating night at Bellingham Country Club when everything finally exploded. But the breaking point, the real moment when I knew there was no going back, happened right here in this very office 3 weeks earlier. I had come in for what I thought was a routine meeting about finalizing the estate distribution. Archie Nelson, my 42-year-old son, had insisted on accompanying me. "Mom, you don't understand these legal documents," he'd said with that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Let me handle the complicated stuff." Sadie Rogers, my 38-year-old daughter, had agreed wholeheartedly. "Dad always said you weren't good with financial matters, Mom. We just want to make sure everything goes smoothly." So there I sat, in the same leather chair I occupied now, watching my own children discuss my late husband's money as if I were invisible. They talked over me, around me, about me, but never to me. Archie spread out charts and calculations he'd prepared, showing how they planned to divide the inheritance. Sadie nodded along, occasionally adding her input about investment strategies and tax implications. "Obviously, Mom will need some money for living expenses," Archie had said, circling, a figure on his yellow legal pad. "We're thinking about $200,000 should be sufficient. That's more than enough for her little apartment and basic needs." "That's generous," Sadie had agreed. "She doesn't really need much. Her lifestyle is pretty simple." Simple. They called my lifestyle simple while they lived in their sprawling suburban homes that I had helped them buy. Archie's wife, Iris Kelly, drove a BMW that I had co-signed for when their credit was shot. Sadie's husband, Lemuel Kelly, owned a boat that I had helped finance during one of their temporary financial difficulties. Eleanor Price had looked uncomfortable during that meeting, glancing at me repeatedly as if waiting for me to speak up. But I had sat there in stunned silence, watching my children carve up their father's legacy like vultures over carrion. The man who had worked 18-hour days as a contractor, building custom homes and saving every penny for his family's future, would have been heartbroken to see this display. "Mrs. Wood," Eleanor had finally interjected, "this is your husband's will we're executing. According to the terms, you are the primary beneficiary with full discretion over distribution. Your children are named as secondary beneficiaries, but the final decisions rest with you." That's when both Archie and Sadie had turned to look at me, really look at me, for the first time during the entire meeting. Not as a person with thoughts and feelings, but as an obstacle to their financial plans. "Well, obviously Mom agrees with our suggestions," Archie had said quickly. "Right, Mom? This makes the most sense for everyone." "Mom knows we'll take good care of her," Sadie had added with a tight smile. "We're not going to abandon her or anything. She'll always have a place at family dinners." A place at family dinners. As if that was some generous gift they were bestowing upon me, rather than basic human decency toward the woman who had given them life and raised them single-handedly when their father worked long hours building his business. I had nodded mutely that day, overwhelmed by the casual cruelty of it all. But driving home in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the car I'd been driving for years while helping them with their car payments, something inside me began to shift. By the time I pulled into my modest apartment complex in Clearwater Heights, a plan was already forming in my mind. That night, I had pulled out Jesse's old photo albums and sat on my living room floor, surrounded by memories of the family we had built together. There were pictures of Archie's high school graduation, where I had worked double shifts at the diner to afford his cap and gown. Photos of Sadie's wedding, which had cost me my entire savings account and forced me to take out a second mortgage on the house we eventually had to sell. In every major moment of their lives, I had been there, not just emotionally, but financially. When Archie needed money for his business degree, I had cashed in my retirement fund. When Sadie's first marriage fell apart and she needed legal fees for her divorce, I had worked 3 jobs to help her get back on her feet. When both of them needed down payments for their houses, I had sold Jesse's truck, his pride and joy, to help them achieve their dreams. And now, sitting in Eleanor's office with the inheritance papers spread before me, I realized that not once, not even once, had either of them ever asked what I wanted or needed. Not once had they considered that their 67-year-old mother might have dreams or plans of her own. To them, I was simply a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved with the smallest possible amount of money. "Mrs. Wood?" Eleanor's voice brought me back to the present moment. "Are you ready to proceed with the charitable transfer?" I looked down at the documents, at the section where my signature would redirect Jesse's entire life's work away from the children who had taken me for granted, and toward an organization that would use it to help sick children get better. Children who would never know Jesse's name but would benefit from his decades of hard work and sacrifice. "Yes," I said firmly, picking up the pen. "I'm absolutely ready." As I signed my name with steady strokes, I thought about that night at Bellingham Country Club, about sitting in that hot car for 4 hours while my family celebrated without me. They had no idea that their cruel treatment had just cost them $2.3 million, but they were about to find out. To understand how it all came to this dramatic moment in Eleanor's office, you need to know what my life had become in the 8 months since Jesse passed away. What started as a period of grieving had slowly transformed into something I never expected, a revelation of who my children really were when they thought no one important was watching. It began innocently enough. 3 days after Jesse's funeral, when the last of the casseroles from well-meaning neighbors had been eaten and the condolence cards had been filed away, Archie showed up at my apartment with a folder full of paperwork and a look of grim determination. "Mom, we need to talk about practical matters," he'd announced, settling himself at my small kitchen table without being invited. "Dad's gone, and now you're going to need help managing things. Iris and I have been discussing it, and we think it's best if we take over handling your finances and major decisions. I remember staring at him. This man I'd raised from a colicky baby into a successful insurance adjuster, wondering when exactly he decided I was incompetent. Archie, I've been managing our household finances for 43 years. Your father handled the business, but I handled everything else. He'd waved his hand dismissively. Mom, that was different. Dad was there to help you. Now you're all alone, and there are big decisions to make. Estate stuff, investment choices, legal matters. It's overwhelming for someone in your position. Someone in my position. As if being a 67-year-old widow automatically rendered me mentally deficient. Sadie had arrived 20 minutes later, armed with her own folder and an equally patronizing attitude. Oh, good. Archie's already here, she'd said, kissing my cheek with the perfunctory affection of someone checking a task off their list. We can get all this sorted out at once. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when they'd presented their plan. They had researched senior living communities, found a lovely assisted living facility called Sunset Gardens about 30 minutes outside of town, and had already scheduled a tour for the following week. It's not that we don't want you around, Sadie had explained with the practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. It's just that your apartment is so small, and you'll be lonely here by yourself. At Sunset Gardens, you'll have activities and people your own age to talk to. People my own age? I'd repeated slowly. Sadie, I'm 67, not 97. I play tennis twice. A week with Martha Henderson from downstairs. I volunteer at the Riverside Community Center Library every Tuesday and Thursday. I have book club on Wednesdays and bridge group on Fridays. I'm hardly sitting here waiting to die. Archie had sighed heavily, as if my resistance was both expected and tiresome. Mom, be realistic. You can't drive forever. What happens when your eyesight goes or your reflexes slow down? What if you fall and no one finds you for days? At least, at Sunset Gardens, there's staff to check on you. My eyesight is fine, I'd protested. I just had my annual eye exam 2 months ago. Dr. Patterson said my vision is better than most people 20 years younger. For now, Iris Kelly had chimed in, speaking for the first time since arriving with Archie. But these things change quickly at your age. My grandmother thought she was fine too, right up until she set the kitchen on fire trying to make toast. The casual cruelty of that comparison had taken my breath away. Jessie had been gone less than a week, and already they were planning to warehouse me like I was some fragile object that might break if left unattended. But the real shock came when they explained the financial arrangements they'd worked out. Sunset Gardens cost $4,200 a month, which they calculated I could afford for exactly 14 months, using Jessie's life insurance money and my modest savings. After that, they'd explained with remarkable calm, I'd need to apply for Medicaid assistance. What about the house? I'd asked, referring to the large family home Jessie and I had built ourselves in Oakmont Hills, which we'd sold 2 years prior when the maintenance became too much for us. What about it? Sadie had looked confused. The money from selling the house. Where did that go? Archie and Sadie had exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Mom, you used that money to help us with our down payments, remember? You said you wanted to see us settled while you were alive to enjoy it. And I had said that when Archie needed help buying his 4-bedroom colonial in Westfield Heights, I'd contributed $80,000. When Sadie and Lemuel were looking at that charming craftsman-style house in Millbrook Estates, I'd provided $95,000 to make their offer competitive. At the time, I'd felt proud to help my children achieve their dreams. Jessie and I still had our small apartment. His business was doing well, and we assumed we had many years ahead of us to rebuild our nest egg. But now, sitting at my kitchen table listening to my children discuss my future like I was a financial burden they needed to manage, I began to understand the true cost of my generosity. Besides, Iris had added helpfully, Once you're at Sunset Gardens, you won't need a car anymore. We can sell that old Honda and put the money toward your monthly fees. That'll buy you maybe another month or two. My Honda Civic, the car I'd bought used 4 years ago when my previous car finally died. The car I'd carefully maintained and babied because I knew it needed to last. They wanted to sell it to squeeze out a few extra weeks before I became dependent on government assistance. What happens after the 14 months? I'd asked quietly. Well, hopefully Dad's estate will be settled by then, Archie had said. Once we get that sorted out, we can revisit your living situation. Sorted out. As if Jesse's life's work was just a mess that needed cleaning up, rather than the legacy of a man who'd worked himself to exhaustion to provide for his family. That night, after they'd finally left with promises to be in touch about the tour schedule, I'd sat alone in my apartment trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 2 hours, my children had dismantled my entire life. My independence, my home, my car, my community connections, all of it deemed unnecessary luxuries that I couldn't afford in my new role as their financial dependent. I'd pulled out the business card for Thornfield and Associates that Jesse's business partner had given me at the funeral. "Call Eleanor when you're ready to deal with the estate," he'd said kindly. Jesse left everything in good order, but there are always details to handle. When I called Eleanor the next morning and scheduled that first appointment, I thought I was just being responsible. I thought I was taking care of the legal requirements so my children could inherit their father's hard-earned money, and I could figure out how to live on whatever was left. I had no idea that appointment would become the first step toward the most liberating decision of my entire life. I had no idea that watching my children treat Jesse's legacy like their personal lottery winnings would finally open my eyes to a truth I'd been avoiding for years. They didn't see me as a person anymore. They saw me as an obligation to be managed, as efficiently and cheaply as possible. But that revelation was still weeks away. For now, I was just a grieving widow trying to navigate the aftermath of loss, unaware that my real education in my children's true character was just beginning. The incident that changed everything happened on a sweltering Thursday evening in late July, exactly 6 months after Jesse's funeral. It was Archie and Iris's 15th wedding anniversary, and they had planned what they called a sophisticated celebration at Bellingham Country Club, the kind of upscale establishment that Jesse and I had always admired from the outside but never felt quite fancy enough to enter. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, delivered not with excitement or warmth, but with the kind of resigned duty you might show when inviting a distant relative you barely tolerate. Iris had called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was tending to my small herb garden on the apartment balcony. "Maeve," she'd begun, using my first name with the casual disrespect that had become her trademark since Jesse died. "Archie and I are having our anniversary dinner at Bellingham Country Club next Thursday. The reservation is for 8 people. Us, Sadie and Lemuel, my parents, and my sister Clara Henderson with her husband." I'd waited for the actual invitation, but it never came. Instead, she continued with the kind of tone someone might use when assigning household chores. "The thing is, parking is going to be a nightmare, and honestly, some of us want to have a few drinks without worrying about driving. We were wondering if you could be our designated driver for the evening. You know, pick everyone up and drop them off safely." I remember gripping the phone tighter, a strange cold feeling spreading through my chest despite the summer heat. "You want me to drive everyone to your anniversary dinner?" "Well, not everyone," Iris had clarified with a little laugh. "Just the family. My parents are driving themselves, and Clara and her husband have their own car. But if you could handle our group, that would be perfect. We'd really appreciate it." Our group. 4 people celebrating an anniversary. 4 people who had apparently planned this entire evening without once considering that the woman who had helped raise the groom, who had paid for half their wedding, who had been part of their family for 15 years, might want to be included in the celebration itself. "Where would I sit during dinner?" I'd asked, though part of me already knew the answer. There had been a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause that stretched across the phone line like a chasm. "Oh," Iris had said finally, her voice taking on that artificially bright tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Well, the thing is, the reservation is just for 8 people, and it's really hard to change at Bellingham Country Club. They're very exclusive about their seating arrangements. But you could wait in the car, or maybe there's a lobby area where you could read a book or something. I'm sure they have magazines. Read a book in the lobby." While my son celebrated 15 years of marriage at a table I had helped pay for, in a dress that I had helped buy, surrounded by friends and family, who would never think to invite the woman who had made it all possible? "How long is dinner usually at a place like that?" I'd asked, my voice strangely calm even as my hands began to shake. "Oh, probably 3 hours or so," Iris had said airily. "Maybe 4 if we order dessert and coffee, but don't worry, the club has beautiful grounds. You could walk around, get some fresh air. It might actually be nice for you to get out of that stuffy apartment for a while." 4 hours. They wanted me to sit in a car for 4 hours while they celebrated their anniversary inside, because apparently hiring a real driver would have been too expensive, but including me in the celebration would have been too inconvenient. "And this was Archie's idea?" I'd asked, though I wasn't sure why I needed the confirmation. "Well, we both thought of it together," Iris had said quickly. "You know how practical Archie is. He said you don't really enjoy fancy restaurants anyway, and this way you'd be helping us out while still being part of the evening. It's really the perfect solution." The perfect solution to a problem I hadn't realized I'd created by existing. I'd agreed, of course. Looking back now, I can't quite explain why. Maybe it was 40 years of conditioning to put everyone else's needs before my own. Maybe it was the shock of realizing how completely my role in the family had shifted since Jesse's death. Or maybe, somewhere deep down, I needed to experience the full extent of their indifference to finally understand what I was dealing with. The night itself was even worse than I'd imagined. I'd dressed carefully, choosing my best navy dress and the pearl earrings Jesse had given me for our 20th anniversary. Some foolish part of me still hoped that when they saw me looking nice, they might reconsider and find a way to include me at their table. After all, Bellingham Country Club was the kind of place that could surely accommodate one extra person, if the request came from valued customers. I picked up Sadie and Lemuel first. Sadie emerged from their Millbrook Estates home looking stunning in an emerald green cocktail dress that I recognized as the one I'd helped her pick out for her cousin's wedding last year. Lemuel wore a sharp navy suit and carried himself with the confident air of someone who belonged in exclusive establishments. "You look nice, Mom," Sadie had said, sliding into the passenger seat of my Honda. But even as she said it, I could see her taking in my outfit with a critical eye, probably calculating whether my appearance would embarrass them if anyone at the club saw me. "Thank you, sweetheart," I'd replied, trying to inject some warmth into the evening. "You look absolutely beautiful. That dress is perfect for the occasion." "Thanks," she'd said, then immediately turned her attention to her phone, scrolling through social media as I navigated the 20-minute drive to Archie and Iris's house in Westfield Heights. The conversation during the drive was stilted and superficial. Lemuel talked about his recent promotion at the accounting firm where he worked. Sadie mentioned that they were thinking about renovating their kitchen and asked if I knew any reliable contractors, a question that stung, given that Jesse had built custom kitchens for half the families in our town. When we arrived at Archie's house, he and Iris emerged looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread. Iris wore a stunning black dress that I'd never seen before, probably purchased specifically for this anniversary celebration. Archie had clearly been to the barber that day, and his suit was expertly tailored. "Perfect timing, Mom," he'd said, climbing into the back seat next to his sister. Traffic shouldn't be too bad getting to the club, and that was it. No acknowledgement of the fact that I was giving up my Thursday evening to serve as their chauffeur. No gratitude for the sacrifice I was making. No recognition that this arrangement was, at best, awkward and, at worst, deliberately hurtful. During the drive to Bellingham Country Club, they chatted excitedly about the menu they'd researched online, the wine pairings they planned to order, and the other couples they'd be dining with. I listened to them discuss their anniversary celebration like I was a piece of furniture. Present, but not really part of the conversation. When we pulled up to the club's elegant entrance, with its perfectly manicured gardens and uniformed valet staff, the reality of the situation hit me with full force. This wasn't just about being excluded from dinner. This was about being relegated to the role of hired help by the people I'd loved and sacrificed for my entire adult life. "We'll probably be done around 11, Archie had said, stepping out of the car without looking back. "Thanks for doing this, Mom. Really appreciate it." And with that, they walked through the club's ornate front doors, leaving me sitting alone in the parking lot, watching other families arrive together for their own celebrations. That's when I finally understood that the family I'd spent 40 years building had died along with my husband. What remained was just a group of people who shared my DNA, but had forgotten that I was a human being worthy of basic respect and consideration. 4 hours in that sweltering car gave me plenty of time to think. And by the time they emerged, laughing and slightly tipsy from their anniversary celebration, I had made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. When the club's ornate doors finally opened at 11:17 p.m. and my family stumbled out into the humid night air, I desperately hoped that someone would acknowledge what had just happened. That someone would express embarrassment about leaving me in the parking lot for over 4 hours. That someone would at least pretend to feel guilty about treating me like hired help. Instead, what I got was something so much worse that it still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Iris was the first to reach the car, her cheeks flushed from wine and her designer dress slightly wrinkled from what had obviously been an elaborate meal. She yanked open the passenger door and collapsed into the seat with a dramatic sigh. "Oh my God, Maeve, you should have seen the dessert course," she gushed, apparently oblivious to the fact that I'd been sitting in a sweltering car while she enjoyed multiple courses of gourmet food. They had this incredible chocolate souffle with gold leaf on top. Gold leaf! Can you believe it? And the wine pairings. Clara's husband knows so much about wine. He explained everything to us. Behind her, Archie, Sadie, and Lemuel were making their way to the car with the careful steps of people who'd had a few too many drinks. Their laughter carried across the parking lot, and I could hear fragments of their conversation about the other diners, the service, the ambiance of the dining room I'd never see. "Mom, you would not believe the view from our table," Sadie said as she slid into the back seat, her voice bright with alcohol and excitement. "We could see the entire golf course, and there was this gorgeous sunset. It was like something out of a movie." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white in the dim light from the dashboard. "That sounds lovely," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "The service was incredible, too," Lemuel added, settling in beside his wife. "Our waiter, James, was so attentive. He knew exactly when to clear each course, when to refill our wine glasses. You could tell he'd been doing this for years. Attentive service. Something I'd been providing for free in a parking lot while they enjoyed professional hospitality inside." Archie was the last to get in, taking his usual spot behind me. As I started the car, he leaned forward and patted my shoulder in what I suppose he thought was a gesture of appreciation. "Thanks for doing this, Mom," he said, his words slightly slurred. "You're the best. Really saved us a lot of money on taxi fare." Saved them money. That's what 4 hours of my life was worth to him, the cost of a taxi ride. As I pulled out of the club's circular driveway, past the uniformed valets who had opened doors for everyone except me, the conversation in the car continued as if I weren't there. They rehashed the highlights of their dinner, laughed about inside jokes from conversations I hadn't been part of, and made plans for future gatherings at other exclusive venues. "We should definitely go back for Iris's birthday," Sadie suggested. "Maybe we could get that same table by the window." "Absolutely," Iris agreed. And next time we should invite my cousin Alice Bell and her husband. They would love this place. Alice Bell. Someone I'd never met was being considered for future invitations, while I, the woman who had driven them there and waited in the parking lot, wasn't even part of the conversation. That's when Lemuel made the comment that shattered what little composure I had left. "You know," he said, his voice taking on the philosophical tone that alcohol sometimes brings, "I was thinking while we were eating, we're so lucky to have Maeve to help us out like this. Most people our age have to worry about taking care of their elderly parents, but Maeve still takes care of herself and even helps us out. It's like having a built-in family assistant. A family assistant. Not a mother, not a mother-in-law, not even a friend. An assistant whose primary value was her willingness to provide free services. That's so true," Iris chimed in immediately. "My mom is always complaining about having to drive my grandmother places, but you never complain about anything, Maeve. You're just so accommodating." Accommodating. The word hung in the air like a curse. 40 years of putting my family's needs before my own, and the best they could say about me was that I was accommodating. But it was Archie's response that delivered the final blow. "Yeah, it's perfect," he said with the casual cruelty that only comes from someone who's never had to question their own privilege. "Mom doesn't really have much of a social life anyway, so it's not like we're taking her away from anything important. And she actually seems to enjoy feeling useful." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought maybe someone, anyone, would speak up. Maybe Sadie would defend me, remind them that I had friends and activities and a life that mattered. Maybe Lemuel would realize how awful that sounded and try to soften it. Maybe Iris would show some basic human decency and acknowledge that what Archie had just said was cruel and untrue. But no one said a word. No one said a word. Instead, the conversation seamlessly moved on to other topics. Sadie started talking about a vacation she and Lemuel were planning to Bermuda. Iris mentioned a new boutique that had opened in downtown Millfield that she wanted to visit. Archie discussed his plans to upgrade their home security system. They talked over me, around me, about their lives and dreams and plans, as if the woman sitting in the driver's seat, the woman who had made many of those dreams possible, was nothing more than a convenient piece of transportation equipment. As I drove through the quiet streets of our town, past houses where other families were probably sharing late-night conversations about their days, their hopes, their love for each other, I finally understood the complete truth of my situation. My children didn't just take me for granted. They actively saw me as less than human. I wasn't a person with feelings, needs, desires, or dignity. I was a resource to be utilized when convenient and ignored when not. When I dropped off Sadie and Lemuel at their beautiful house in Millbrook Estates, the house I'd helped them buy, Sadie gave me a quick peck on the cheek and said, "Thanks, Mom. This was really fun. We should do it again sometime. We should do it again." As if sitting in a parking lot for 4 hours while excluded from a family celebration was something I might want to repeat. Archie and Iris were even worse when I pulled into their driveway in Westfield Heights. Iris stumbled out of the car without so much as a goodbye, already pulling out her phone to post pictures from their anniversary dinner on social media. Archie lingered for a moment, but only to ask if I could pick up his dry cleaning the next day since it was on my way to the grocery store. The drive back to my apartment in Clearwater Heights was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat at red lights staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing a woman I barely recognized. When had I become this person? When had I allowed myself to become so invisible that my own children could discuss my worthlessness right in front of me without a second thought? By the time I pulled into my parking space outside my modest apartment building, the decision was crystallizing in my mind. The inheritance meeting with Eleanor Price was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I had been planning to go through with their suggested distribution, keeping just enough for my basic needs while giving them the bulk of Jesse's life's work. But after tonight, after sitting in that parking lot for 4 hours and then listening to my own family discuss my irrelevance like I was a piece of furniture. I realized something important. Jesse had worked 18-hour days and sacrificed his health to build something for his family. But the family he'd loved and provided for was gone. What remained were 4 people who had forgotten that love and sacrifice were supposed to be mutual, that family was supposed to be built on respect and care, not just financial convenience. They wanted to treat me like a servant who should be grateful for scraps? Fine, but servants get paid for their work, and it was time to send them a bill. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my small living room until dawn, surrounded by photo albums and financial records, finally seeing my life with the kind of brutal clarity that only comes from having your illusions completely shattered. The photographs told a story I'd never let myself fully acknowledge. There I was at Archie's college graduation, beaming with pride as he accepted his diploma. A diploma I'd paid for by working double shifts at Morrison's diner while Jesse worked, construction projects that kept him away for weeks at a time. In the photo, Archie was surrounded by his fraternity brothers and their families, all of them dressed in expensive clothes and planning celebration dinners at upscale restaurants. I was standing at the edge of the group, wearing my best dress from Walmart and holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, looking grateful just to be included in the picture. I flipped through more pages, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Sadie's wedding photos showed me in the background, serving cake to guests while the professional photographer captured the important family moments. At Archie and Iris's housewarming party, I was in the kitchen, cleaning up while everyone else mingled on the deck I'd helped them afford. At every family gathering, every milestone celebration, every important moment, I was there. But I was working. When had I become the hired help at my own family's celebrations? I pulled out the financial records Jesse had kept meticulously organized in his desk drawer. Bank statements, receipts, canceled checks, 40 years of documentation that painted a picture I'd never wanted to see clearly. The numbers were staggering. $80,000 for Archie's house down payment, $95,000 for Sadie's, $25,000 for Archie's college tuition that his scholarships didn't cover, $18,000 for Sadie's wedding dress and reception upgrades, $12,000 for Iris's BMW down payment when their credit was denied, $8,000 for Lemuel's dental work when he was between jobs, $15,000 for various emergency loans that had never been repaid, car, repairs, medical bills, home improvements that somehow always became urgent right around my birthday or Christmas. I calculated it 3 times before I could believe the total, $253,000. $250,000 I had given my children over the years, not including the countless hours of free childcare, home-cooked meals, laundry service, and emotional support. But it wasn't really the money that finally opened my eyes. It was a memory that surfaced as I sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, triggered by finding a receipt from Sadie's wedding venue. I remembered the conversation Jesse and I had 6 months before Sadie's wedding, when the costs started spiraling beyond anything we'd planned for. Sadie had come to us in tears, explaining that the venue required a larger deposit than expected, that the flowers were more expensive than she'd researched, that the dress she'd fallen in love with was $3,000 more than her budget. "I don't know what to do," she'd sobbed, sitting at our kitchen table while Jesse and I tried to figure out how to make the numbers work. "I can't have the wedding I've dreamed of my whole life. Maybe Lemuel and I should just elope." Jesse had looked at me across that table, and I'd seen the exhaustion in his eyes. He'd been working 70-hour weeks on a major commercial project, pushing his 60-year-old body to its limits because we needed the overtime pay. But when he looked at our daughter's tears, he'd nodded. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart," he'd said quietly. "Your mother and I will take care of it." And we had. Jesse picked up an additional weekend job doing small residential repairs. Despite the fact that his back had started bothering him more and more, I'd taken on extra shifts at the diner and started cleaning houses for wealthy families in Oakmont Hills on my days off. For 6 months, We'd worked ourselves to exhaustion so our daughter could have her dream wedding. But here's what I remembered, with perfect, painful clarity. At no point during those 6 months of sacrifice did Sadie ever ask us how we were managing the extra expense. She never asked if we needed help, if we were okay, if the additional burden was affecting our health or our retirement plans. She simply accepted our sacrifice as her due, sent us updates about flower arrangements and menu tastings, and expected us to smile and be excited about choices we were paying for but had no input on. And at the wedding itself, when people complimented her on the beautiful ceremony and elaborate reception, she never once mentioned that her parents had made it possible. Instead, she thanked her wedding planner, her caterer, her florist, everyone, except the 2 people who had worked themselves to exhaustion to pay for it all. That's when I understood that the pattern hadn't started with Jesse's death. It had been there for years, maybe decades. My children had learned to see my sacrifices not as gifts born of love, but as services they were entitled to receive. My exhaustion wasn't something that concerned them. It was simply the cost of getting what they wanted. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for their behavior. When Archie forgot my birthday 3 years in a row, I told myself he was just busy with work. When Sadie stopped calling unless she needed something, I convinced myself that was normal for young married couples. When Iris started treating me like household staff during family gatherings, I rationalized that she was just stressed about hosting. But sitting there at 4 a.m., surrounded by evidence of my own willful blindness, I finally admitted the truth. My children had become people I wouldn't want to know if we weren't related. They were selfish, entitled, and cruel, and I had enabled every bit of it by accepting their treatment without protest. The worst part was realizing how they saw Jesse's death, not as the loss of a beloved husband and father, but as a business opportunity. They'd started planning how to spend his money before he was cold in the ground. They'd viewed my grief not as something deserving compassion and support, but as an inconvenience that complicated their financial planning. I picked up the business, card for Thornfield and Associates, and stared at Eleanor Price's name. In 3 days, I was supposed to meet with her to finalize the estate distribution. For weeks, I'd been dreading that meeting, overwhelmed by the complexity of legal documents and financial decisions I'd never had to make alone. But now, sitting in my living room as the sun began to rise over Clearwater Heights, I realized I wasn't overwhelmed anymore. I was angry, furiously, righteously angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in decades. Jesse had worked himself into an early grave to build something for his family, but the family he'd loved was gone, replaced by 4 adults who measured our worth only in terms of what we could provide for them. They wanted his money? They wanted to treat me like a servant while they divided up his life's work? Fine, but servants quit when they're not treated well, and they don't leave forwarding addresses. I got up, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at Jesse's old desk to make some phone calls. The first was to Eleanor Price to move up our appointment. The second was to the Children's Hospital Foundation to ask about their donation procedures. The third call was to my neighbor Martha Henderson to ask if she knew any good travel agents. By the time my children woke up that Friday morning, probably nursing hangovers from their anniversary celebration, I had already begun planning their biggest surprise ever. They thought they were inheriting Jesse's legacy? They were about to learn that legacies have to be earned. And after last night, after listening to them discuss my irrelevance while I sat behind the wheel of a car I could barely afford, they had proven beyond any doubt that they hadn't earned a single penny of their father's sacrifice. But someone had. Somewhere in this city, there were children fighting for their lives in hospital beds, children whose families were struggling to pay for treatment, children who would never know Jesse's name but who would benefit from his decades of backbreaking work and careful saving. Those children deserved Jesse's legacy. My children deserved exactly what they had given me over the past 8 months. Nothing but the opportunity to learn what life looked like when no one cared about their needs, their comfort, or their future. It was time for them to find out how. It felt to be truly alone. To understand how my children became the entitled, heartless adults who could leave their mother sitting in a parking lot for 4 hours, I need to take you back to where it all began. The pattern didn't start with Jesse's death. It had been growing like a slow-acting poison for over 20 years, and I was the one who had mixed the formula. It started when Archie was in high school and wanted to play on the lacrosse team. Lacrosse wasn't offered at Riverdale Regional High School where all the local kids went, but it was available at prestigious Thornbury Academy across town, a private school that cost more per year than Jesse made in 6 months of construction. "Work? Please, Mom," Archie had begged, sitting at our kitchen table with brochures spread before him like treasure maps. "Coach Morrison says I have real potential, and Thornbury Academy has connections to all the best colleges. Kids from there get full scholarships to places like Princeton and Yale." Jesse and I had looked at each other across that table, both of us exhausted from working double shifts. Him on construction sites, me at Morrison's diner and cleaning houses on weekends. The tuition alone would require me to take on a third job, probably cleaning offices at night after the diner closed. "Son," Jesse had said carefully, "we want what's best for you, but that's a lot of money. Maybe we can look into the community college's sports programs." "Community college?" Archie had interrupted, his 17-year-old voice cracking with indignation. "Dad, my friends are going to real colleges. I don't want to be stuck here, forever like." He'd caught himself before finishing the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. Like his parents, like the working-class people who'd raised him and loved him and given him everything they had. That night, Jesse and I had talked until 3 a.m., calculating and recalculating numbers that never quite worked. But in the end, love won over mathematics. We enrolled Archie at Thornbury Academy, and I started cleaning the Eastbridge Medical Center offices from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., 3 nights a week. I told myself it was an investment in his future. What I didn't realize was that I was teaching him that my sleep, my health, and my dignity were less important than his desires. The transformation was subtle at first. At Thornbury Academy, Archie was surrounded by kids whose parents were doctors, lawyers, and business owners. Kids who got new cars for their 16th birthdays and took spring break trips to Europe. Kids who assumed that having money was the natural order of things, and that anyone who didn't have it simply wasn't trying hard enough. Archie started coming home with stories about his new friends' families. The Whitman family had a house in the Hamptons. The Patterson family took ski trips to Aspen every Christmas. The Turner family had a yacht that they kept docked at Harbor Bay Marina. "Mom," he'd say over dinner, his voice taking on that tone teenagers use when they're embarrassed by their parents. "Could you maybe not pick me up in the Honda anymore? My friends think it's weird that your car makes that noise when you start it." The car made that noise because it was 12 years old and we couldn't afford to fix the starter. But instead of explaining that to Archie, instead of helping him understand the value of hard work and financial responsibility, I started parking around the corner from the school and walking the extra 2 blocks to pick him up. Sadie was even worse. By the time she was ready for high school, Archie was already at Thornbury Academy, and she assumed she would go there too. When Jesse gently suggested that maybe she could thrive at Riverdale Regional, where they had an excellent theater program that matched her interests, she'd looked at him like he'd suggested she attend school in a prison. "Daddy, I can't go to Riverdale," she'd said with the dramatic flair she'd perfected by age 14. "Everyone who goes there ends up working at the mall or getting pregnant before graduation. I have dreams." Dreams. As if Jesse and I hadn't had dreams too. As if we'd chosen to work ourselves to exhaustion because we enjoyed it, rather than because we were sacrificing our own ambitions for theirs. But we enrolled her at Thornbury Academy, too, which meant I took on additional cleaning jobs at the Sunrise Shopping Center, scrubbing food court tables and mopping floors from midnight until dawn on weekends. Jesse started taking construction jobs farther and farther from home, sometimes staying in cheap motels during the week because the commute wasn't feasible. That's when my children learned their first real lesson in entitlement, that their parents, Suffering was an acceptable price for their happiness. The lesson deepened during their college years. Archie got into a decent state university, but not with the full scholarship he'd been expecting. His grades at Thornbury Academy had been good but not exceptional. It turned out that being surrounded by wealth didn't automatically translate into academic achievement. "I need to go to college, Mom," he'd announced, as if this was some kind of revelation. "All my friends are going to college. I can't be the only one who doesn't go." The state university cost $28,000 a year. With room and board, books, and living expenses, we were looking at over $35,000 annually. Jessie and I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd made so many impossible decisions over the years, and tried to figure out how to make it work. "We could take out a second mortgage on the house," Jessie had suggested quietly. "Or maybe I could get a loan against my tools." His tools. The expensive professional-grade tools he'd spent 20 years collecting, each one carefully chosen and maintained like the precious instruments they were. The tools that represented his skill, his expertise, his identity as a craftsman. He was willing to risk losing them so our son could go to college with his friends. I'd started working at 3 different locations by then: Morrison's Diner during the day, the medical center at night, and various houses around Oakmont Hills. On weekends, I was so tired most of the time that I'd catch myself falling asleep standing up. But when Archie needed college money, I took on a 4th job cleaning vacation rentals at Crystal Lake Resort, scrubbing toilets and changing sheets for wealthy families who came up from the city for long weekends. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion or the constant stress about money. The worst part was watching my children absorb the lesson that my sacrifice was normal, expected, and their right. When Archie called home from college, he never asked how we were managing the tuition payments. He complained about his dorm room being too small, his meal plan not offering enough variety, his professors being too demanding. When Jesse missed his parents' 50th wedding anniversary because he couldn't afford to take time off work, Archie's response was to ask if we could send him more money for textbooks. Sadie was even more demanding during her college years. She chose Meridian Arts College, a private institution that cost twice as much as the state university, and offered degrees in fields like creative expression and holistic communication studies. When Jesse questioned whether this was a practical choice, Sadie had accused him of not believing in her artistic potential. "I'm not going to live a small life like you and Mom," she'd declared with the casual cruelty that only comes from never having to question where your next meal is coming from. "I'm going to make something of myself, make something of herself," as if raising 2 children while working multiple jobs hadn't made me into something, as if building custom homes and providing for a family hadn't made Jesse into something. But the final insult came during their senior years of college, when both children started bringing home their new partners for holiday visits. Iris Kelly, who Archie had met in his economics class, came from a family that owned a chain of hardware stores across 3 states. She was lovely and polite, but there was something in her eyes when she looked around our modest home, a calculation, a judgment that I pretended not to notice. Lemuel Kelly came from old money in Eastbridge Heights, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so many generations they'd forgotten what it was like to work for a living. He was charming and well-educated, but he had the soft hands and confident demeanor of someone who'd never doubted that the world would provide for him. Both Iris and Lemuel were gracious enough during their visits, but I could see them taking inventory. The secondhand furniture, the small bedrooms, the kitchen with appliances that had been old when we bought them, used 15 years earlier. They were polite, but it was the politeness of people visiting a museum exhibit about how the other half lives, and my children, my own children, started seeing our home through their partner's eyes. Suddenly, the house Jesse had built with his own hands wasn't charming and cozy. It was embarrassingly small. The furniture I'd carefully chosen from thrift stores and estate sales wasn't eclectic and resourceful. It was shabby and outdated. Mom, Sadie had said one evening after Lemuel had gone to bed in the guest room that had once been her childhood bedroom, do you think maybe you and Dad could fix up the house a little? It's just that Lemuel comes from a really nice family, and I want him to feel comfortable here. Fix up the house. With what money? The money we were spending on her education? The money Jesse was earning with his aging body and deteriorating knees? The money I was scraping together by cleaning other people's homes because my own wasn't good enough for my daughter's boyfriend? That's when I realized that my children weren't just entitled, they were ashamed of us. All those years of sacrifice, all those sleepless nights and aching backs and missed family gatherings, and they were embarrassed to bring their friends home. But instead of confronting that painful truth, instead of demanding the respect we'd earned through decades of love and sacrifice, Jesse and I did what we'd always done. We found a way to give them what they wanted. We took out a home equity loan and renovated the house. New furniture, fresh paint, updated appliances that we're probably still paying for even though Jesse never lived to see the loan paid off. We turned our home into something presentable enough for our children's new social circles, and in the process, we created the template for the rest of our relationship with them. Our needs didn't matter. Our comfort didn't matter. Our financial security didn't matter. What mattered was making sure Archie and Sadie never had to feel embarrassed about where they came from, even if it meant we couldn't afford to retire, couldn't take vacations, couldn't enjoy the later years of our marriage. By the time they graduated from college and got married, the pattern was set in stone. We were the people you called when you needed something. We were the safety net, the bank, the free labor force. We were grandparents who babysat without being asked, and parents who provided without being thanked. We were everything to them except people whose happiness mattered. And sitting in my living room that Friday morning, watching the sun rise over a life I'd spent decades giving away piece by piece, I finally understood that the woman who'd been left in a parking lot for 4 hours wasn't the victim of a sudden cruelty. She was the inevitable result of 20 years of teaching my children that cruelty was acceptable as long as it was convenient. The conversation that sealed my children's fate happened 3 days after the Bellingham Country Club incident. On a Sunday afternoon when I thought, foolishly as it turned out, that maybe there was still a chance for redemption. Maybe the wine and excitement of their anniversary celebration had clouded their judgment. Maybe in the sober light of a weekend morning, one of them would call to apologize for leaving me in that parking lot. Instead, what I got was something so much worse that it removed any lingering doubt about what I needed to do. I was in my small kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner out of habit more than hunger, when my phone rang. It was Sadie, and for a moment, my heart lifted with the desperate hope that she was calling to acknowledge what had happened Thursday night. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, as if we were picking up a perfectly normal conversation. "I hope you're not busy. Lemuel and I are having lunch with Iris and Archie at that new brunch place in downtown Millfield. You know, the one with the mimosas and the live jazz music? Anyway, we got to talking about Thursday night." My chest tightened. Here it comes, I thought. The apology, the recognition, maybe even an invitation to join them for lunch as a way to make amends. "And we realized," Sadie continued, her tone taking on the conspiratorial excitement of someone sharing good news, "that we never properly thanked you for being our designated driver. It was so helpful, and we want to make sure you know how much we appreciate it. Appreciate it." They wanted to thank me for sitting in a parking lot for 4 hours while they enjoyed a celebration I'd helped pay for but wasn't invited to attend. That's very thoughtful," I managed to say, gripping the phone tighter. "So we came up with the perfect way to show our appreciation," Sadie went on, apparently oblivious to the strangled quality of my voice. "You know how you're always saying you don't get out much? Well, we've decided that from now on, you can be our regular designated driver for special occasions. Think about it. You'll get to see all the nicest restaurants and clubs in town, even if you're not actually eating there, It's like being a food critic, but from the parking lot." She laughed at her own joke, a sound that might as well have been nails on a chalkboard. In the background, I could hear the others laughing too. My son, my daughter-in-law, my son-in-law, all of them finding hilarity in the idea of turning my humiliation into a regular arrangement. "Plus," Sadie continued, "it solves so many problems at once. We save money on taxi fare, we don't have to worry about drinking and driving, and you get to feel useful. It's really a win-win-win situation." Feel useful. There it was again. That word that had become like a knife between my ribs, as if my only value to them was my willingness to perform services they couldn't be bothered to pay for. And the best part, Archie's voice came through the phone. Apparently, Sadie had put me on speaker so they could all participate in this conversation. "Is that Mom doesn't really drink anyway, so she's the perfect designated driver. Remember how she used to nurse a single glass of wine for an entire evening? She's practically a natural teetotaler." I didn't drink much because alcohol was expensive and Jesse and I had always prioritized their needs over our own pleasures. But they'd interpreted my frugality as some kind of personal preference that made me ideally suited for unpaid chauffeur duty. "We've already started making a list of places we want to try," Iris chimed in, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "There's that new steakhouse in Harbor District that's supposed to be amazing. And Lemuel heard about a wine bar in Eastbridge Heights that does these incredible tasting menus. Oh, and there's supposed to be a really exclusive jazz club opening. Next month, that only takes reservations for parties of 6 or more. They were planning my future as their personal driver, mapping out a social calendar that would keep me sitting in parking lots while they enjoyed experiences I would never be invited to share. And they were discussing it like it was some kind of generous gift they were offering me. The only thing we need to figure out," Lemuel added, "is whether we should set up some kind of schedule so you can plan ahead, or just call you when something comes up. What do you think would work better? For you, Maeve." Maeve, not Mom, not even Mrs. Wood. Just Maeve, like I was their employee rather than the woman who had raised 2 of them and helped support the other 2 through their early married years. "We were thinking maybe twice a month," Sadie suggested. "That way it's regular enough that you can count on it, but not so often that it interferes with your, well, whatever it is you do with your time. Whatever it is you do with your time." As if my life was so empty and meaningless that sitting in parking lots would constitute an improvement. That's when Archie delivered the final blow, the comment that burned away any remaining hope I might have harbored for our relationship. "Honestly, this is probably the most exciting social life Mom's had since Dad died," he said with casual cruelty. "I mean, what else is she going to do? Sit in that depressing apartment and watch television? At least this way she gets to see a little bit of the world, even if it's just from the driver's seat." The others laughed again, apparently finding great humor in the idea that my life was so pathetic that serving as their unpaid transportation would constitute a social upgrade. But then Iris said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, my friend Clara Henderson's mother-in-law does the same thing for their family," she said thoughtfully. "Clara says it's perfect because the old woman gets to feel involved without actually having to be included, if you know what I mean. Like, she's technically part of the evening, but she's not taking up space at the table or making conversation that slows down the flow of the meal. Not taking up space, not slowing down the flow of conversation. They weren't just planning to use me as their driver. They were planning to use me as their invisible servant, present enough to be useful, but absent enough not to inconvenience them." "That's exactly right," Sadie agreed enthusiastically. "It's like having a family member who's there to help but doesn't need to be entertained. Perfect for both sides. Both sides. As if there were 2 equal parties in this arrangement, rather than 3 couples planning to exploit a lonely widow's desperate desire to remain connected to her family. "So what do you say, Mom?" Archie asked, his voice taking on the coaxing tone he might use with a reluctant child. "Are you up for being our official family chauffeur? We promise to tip you in appreciation." And maybe bring you leftover dessert. When the portions are too big to finish, leftover dessert. They were offering me table scraps as payment for hours of unpaid labor and public humiliation. The silence stretched across the phone line as I stood in my kitchen, staring out the window at the modest apartment complex where I'd lived since Jesse's death. In the parking lot below, I could see other residents going about their Sunday routines, walking dogs, carrying groceries, living their quiet but dignified lives. "Mom?" Sadie's voice cut through my thoughts. "Are you still there? What do you think about our plan?" What did I think? I thought that I had raised monsters. I thought that Jesse would be heartbroken to see what his children had become. I thought that somewhere along the way, my love had curdled into something toxic that had poisoned everything it touched. But what I said was, "Let me think about it and get back to you." "Oh, don't think too hard about it," Iris laughed. "It's not like it's a difficult decision. It's basically just asking if you want to help your family while getting out of the house more often. Help your family, as if sitting in parking lots was some kind of charitable service I'd be providing, rather than a degrading arrangement that would formalize my status as their unpaid servant." After I hung up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the wall where Jesse's picture hung. In the photo, he was wearing his work clothes and smiling, holding up the keys to the first house we'd ever owned, a small 2-bedroom place that had felt like a mansion to us back then. Jesse had been so proud of what we'd built together: a family, a home, a legacy of hard work and love. But the family was gone now, replaced by 4 adults who saw me as a convenience to be utilized rather than a person to be cherished. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no going back. The conversation I'd just endured wasn't an aberration or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the logical next step in a relationship that had been moving toward this point for years. They didn't want to make amends for Thursday night. They wanted to institutionalize it. They didn't see leaving me in that parking lot as a cruelty that needed to be corrected. They saw it as a successful arrangement that should be repeated. And most telling of all, they didn't see me as a human being whose feelings and dignity mattered. They saw me as a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved, a convenience to be scheduled. I picked up my phone and dialed Eleanor Price's number. When she answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Eleanor, this is Maeve Wood. I need to move up our appointment to tomorrow morning if possible. I've made some decisions about the estate distribution that I need to put in writing as soon as possible." "Of course, Mrs. Wood," she said, though I could hear the surprise in her voice. "Is everything all right?" I looked at Jesse's picture again, at the pride and hope in his eyes, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. Something hard and cold and final. "Everything is perfect," I said. "I'm finally seeing the situation clearly." And for the first time in months, that was absolutely true. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes most people want to stay in bed and postpone difficult decisions. But I woke up at 5 a.m. feeling more clear-headed and purposeful than I had in years. Today was the day I would take back control of my life and Jesse's legacy. My first stop was Riverdale Community Bank, where Jesse and I had maintained our accounts for over 30 years. I needed to gather all the financial documents that Eleanor would require, and more importantly, I needed to understand exactly what I was giving away and what my children were losing. Patricia Novak, the branch manager, who had helped us with our mortgage 20 years ago, greeted me with the kind of professional warmth reserved for long-standing customers. "Mrs. Wood, how lovely to see you. I hope you're doing well. What can we help you with today?" "I need copies of all account statements for the past 2 years," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "And I need a complete summary of all assets, including the business accounts from Morgan Construction." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite a comprehensive request. Are you working with an attorney on estate matters?" "Yes," I replied. I'm meeting with Eleanor Price this afternoon to finalize some distributions. What I didn't mention was that those distributions were going to be very different from what anyone expected. As Patricia printed out document after document, the full scope of Jesse's legacy became starkly clear. The construction business that he'd built from nothing was worth $1.8 million after liquidation. Our personal savings, retirement accounts, and life insurance brought the total to $2.3 million, a fortune by the standards of people who'd started with nothing and worked for everything they had. Jesse had been far more successful than even I had realized. While we'd lived modestly, driving used cars and shopping at discount stores, he'd been carefully building something substantial for our family's future. Every weekend job, every 18-hour day, every missed family gathering because he was working. It had all been for this moment when his children would inherit the fruits of his sacrifice. Looking at those numbers, I felt a brief stab of doubt. Was I really going to give away $2.3 million because my feelings were hurt? Was I being petty and vindictive? But then I remembered Archie's voice from yesterday. Most exciting social life moms had since Dad died. I remembered Iris laughing about me being a food critic from the parking lot. I remembered all of them planning my future degradation like it was some kind of gift they were bestowing upon me. No, this wasn't about hurt feelings. This was about justice. My second stop was the Clearwater Heights Public Library, where I spent 2 hours researching charitable organizations. I wanted to make sure Jesse's money went somewhere that would honor the values he'd lived by: hard work, compassion for those less fortunate, and the belief that everyone deserved a chance to build something better. The Children's Hospital Foundation was perfect. They funded medical care for families who couldn't afford it, exactly the kind of people Jesse and I had been for most of our lives. They also had an education fund that helped children from working-class families attend college, children whose parents worked multiple jobs and sacrificed their own comfort for their kids' futures, children who would appreciate the gift instead of treating it as their due. I called their development office from the library's phone and spoke with a woman named Margaret Taylor, who handled major donations. When I explained what I wanted to do, she was initially stunned into silence. "Mrs. Wood," she said carefully, "this is an incredibly generous gift. Are you certain this is what you want to do? Have you discussed this with your family?" "My family forfeited their right to be consulted about this decision," I replied. "This money will do more good in your hands than it would in theirs." Margaret asked me to come in that afternoon before my appointment with Eleanor to meet with their board and discuss the details of the donation. She wanted to make sure I understood the tax implications and the irreversible nature of what I was proposing. I understood perfectly. Irreversible was exactly what I wanted. My third stop was Westfield Heights Travel Agency, a small office I'd noticed during the countless times I'd driven through Archie's neighborhood running errands for him. I'd never been inside before. Jesse and I had never been able to afford vacations that required a travel agent. But today, I walked through those doors with purpose. The agent, a woman named Dorothy King with kind eyes and silver hair, listened as I explained what I wanted. A cruise through the Mediterranean, lasting 6 weeks, departing in 2 months. Something elegant but not ostentatious, on a ship with libraries and art classes and quiet places to sit and think. "This sounds wonderful," Dorothy said, pulling out brochures and deck plans. "Is this a special occasion trip?" "You could say that," I replied. "It's a celebration of my independence." The cruise would cost $18,000, including airfare and shore excursions. A year ago, that amount would have represented 2 years of careful saving. But with the inheritance documentation in my purse, it felt like pocket change. Money I could spend on myself without guilt for the first time in decades. "I'll need to book this under your maiden name," I told Dorothy. "Alice Henderson. And I don't want anyone to be able to trace my travel plans." Dorothy gave me a look that suggested she'd helped other women disappear from complicated family situations before. Of course, Mrs. Henderson. We'll handle this with complete discretion. By noon, I had accomplished more in 6 hours than I had in the previous 6 months. I had documentation of Jesse's estate, a plan for its distribution, and a ticket to a new life. All that remained was the formal meeting with Eleanor Price to make it official. I treated myself to lunch at Meridian Cafe, a charming little restaurant in downtown Clearwater Heights that I'd driven past 1,000 times but never entered. I ordered a glass of wine with my salad, something I hadn't done since Jesse's funeral, and sat by the window watching people hurry by on their lunch hour errands. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what my children needed, what tasks they'd assigned me, or how I could better serve their convenience. I was just a woman having lunch, planning her future, taking up space in the world without apology. When I arrived at Thornfield and Associates that afternoon, Eleanor Price was waiting with the completed documentation spread across her conference table. The transfer papers, the charitable donation forms, the trust documents that would ensure my children never saw a penny of their father's money. "Mrs. Wood," she said as I took my seat, "I want to make sure you've thought this through completely. This donation will transfer 100% of your husband's estate to the Children's Hospital Foundation. Your children will inherit nothing except some personal effects and household items. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" I looked at the papers, at Jesse's name printed in neat legal text, at the dollar amounts that represented 40 years of his labor and sacrifice. Then I thought about Thursday night in that parking lot, about Sunday's phone call, about 20 years of teaching my children that my dignity was negotiable. "Eleanor," I said, picking up the pen, "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." I signed my name on line after line, page after page, each signature transferring another portion of Jesse's legacy away from the ungrateful children who had forgotten that love was supposed to be mutual. With each signature, I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I had been in years. "There's one more thing," I said as Eleanor collected the signed documents. "I don't want them to know about this until after I'm gone." "Gone?" Eleanor looked concerned. "Mrs. Wood, you're not—" "Gone on vacation," I clarified quickly. "I'm taking a cruise for 6 weeks, leaving in 2 months. I want you to inform them of the estate distribution while I'm traveling, when they can't immediately confront me about it." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's probably wise. Strong emotions and legal documents don't mix well." Strong emotions. That was one way to put it. Another way would be to say that my children were about to discover that actions have consequences, and that treating someone like a servant eventually results in being cut out of the will, like a servant who's been dismissed for poor performance. I left Thornfield and Associates that afternoon, walking out into the gray drizzle with a briefcase full of copies and receipts. I felt like I was stepping into a completely new life. The old Maeve Wood, the one who sacrificed everything for ungrateful children, who accepted humiliation as the price of remaining connected to her family, was gone. In her place was Alice Henderson, a woman who was about to spend 6 weeks sailing through the Mediterranean, reading books and taking art classes and eating meals. She didn't have to cook for people who would actually appreciate her company. My children thought they were inheriting $2.3 million. Instead, they were about to learn that the woman they'd left sitting in a parking lot had just given away their entire future to children who would never take her for granted. And the beautiful thing was, they wouldn't find out until it was far too late to do anything about it. The 2 months between signing those papers and boarding the cruise ship were simultaneously the longest and shortest weeks of my life. I had to maintain the illusion of being the same accommodating mother, while secretly preparing for a complete transformation that would shock everyone who thought they knew me. The hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was pretending to care about my children's plans and problems when I knew that in 8 weeks, their entire world would collapse around them. 3 days after my meeting with Eleanor, Iris called with an update on their designated driver plan. She'd made a reservation at Harbor District Steakhouse for the following Saturday and wanted to confirm that I was available for chauffeur duty. "We're so excited about this new arrangement," she gushed over the phone. "Archie calculated that we'll save almost $200 a month on transportation costs if we use you instead of ride-sharing apps. Plus, we won't have to worry about surge pricing during busy nights." Surge pricing. They were comparing me to a taxi service and congratulating themselves on finding a cheaper alternative. "That sounds lovely," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that I was mentally calculating how much $200 a month would mean to a child receiving cancer treatment at the hospital that would soon benefit from Jesse's estate. "Perfect. We'll need you to pick us up at 6:30. "Oh, and Maeve, could you maybe clean your car before Saturday? Lemuel mentioned that it smelled a little musty last time, and we want to make a good impression when we arrive at the restaurant." Agreed, of course. What else could I do? But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. They wanted me to detail my car for their convenience, not knowing that in a few months I'd be trading it in for something much nicer, something purchased with the money I'd earned from selling my apartment and starting fresh somewhere far from their demands. That Saturday night played out exactly as I'd expected. 4 hours in the parking lot of Harbor District Steakhouse while they enjoyed a $300 meal inside. When they finally emerged, slightly drunk and completely oblivious to my sacrifice, Archie handed me a small white box. "Here, Mom," he said with the magnanimous air of someone bestowing a great gift. "We brought you some leftover bread pudding. The portions were huge and we couldn't finish everything." Leftover bread pudding. The scraps from their table, offered, like I should be grateful for the privilege of eating their remainders. "Thank you," I said, accepting the box with the same grace I'd shown for 20 years. "That's very thoughtful." But instead of eating it when I got home, I threw it in the garbage and ordered myself a beautiful dinner from the Italian restaurant near my apartment. Ossobuco with risotto and a bottle of Chianti that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. I sat at my kitchen table, eating by candlelight and toasting Jesse's picture with every sip of wine. "Here's to justice delayed but not denied," I whispered to his smiling face. The following weeks brought a parade of increasingly ridiculous requests from my children. Sadie needed me to house sit while she and Lemuel took a long weekend in Asheville, not because they trusted me with their home, but because kenneling their dog would have cost $150. Archie wanted me to help Iris move furniture in their basement, a job that took 6 hours and left me with a backache that lasted for days. Each request came with the same underlying assumption that I had nothing better to do than serve their convenience. Each task was presented as a favor they were allowing me to perform, rather than free labor they were demanding from an elderly woman. But the most telling incident happened 3 weeks before my departure date. I was at Dorothy King's travel agency, finalizing the details of my cruise and discussing shore excursions, when my phone rang. It was Archie, calling with barely controlled panic in his voice. "Mom, thank God you answered," he said without preamble. "I need you to drive to Eastbridge Heights right now and pick up Iris from her sister's house. She had too much wine at their book club and can't drive home." I glanced at Dorothy, who was listening with poorly concealed amusement to my side of the conversation. "Archie, I'm in the middle of something important right now. Can't you go get her yourself?" "I'm at a work dinner," he said, his voice taking, on the edge of irritation that appeared whenever I failed to immediately comply with his demands. "This is important for my career, Mom. I can't just leave." "What about calling a taxi for Iris? Do you know how much a taxi from Eastbridge Heights costs? Besides, she's family. Family helps family. Family helps family." The irony of that statement, coming from a man who'd left his mother sitting in parking lots and demanded she clean her car for his convenience, was almost too much to bear. "I really can't right now, Archie. I'm at an appointment that I can't reschedule." There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. When Archie finally spoke, His voice was cold and sharp. What appointment could possibly be more important than helping your family? It's not like you have a job or anything pressing to do. What could you possibly be doing that's so crucial? What could I possibly be doing? As if my life was so empty and meaningless that any request from them should automatically take priority over my own needs. That's when something snapped inside me. Not the explosive kind of snap that had happened in Eleanor's office, but a quieter, more definitive break. The last thread connecting me to the woman who had spent 40 years prioritizing everyone else's needs finally severed. "You know what, Archie?" I said, my voice calm and clear. "You're absolutely right. I don't have anything more important to do than help my family. So here's what I'm going to do for you." I hung up the phone and turned it off. Dorothy King stared at me with wide eyes, clearly having heard enough of the conversation to understand what had just happened. "That was my son," I explained. "He wanted me to drop everything and drive 40 minutes to pick up his drunk wife because calling a taxi would be expensive." "And you said no?" I said no. The words felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a foreign language I was just learning to pronounce. I think that might be the first time I've ever said no to one of my children without offering an alternative solution. Dorothy smiled, a real smile, not the polite professional one she'd been wearing earlier. "How does it feel?" I considered the question seriously. How did it feel to put my own needs first? To refuse an unreasonable demand without guilt or apology? To let my adult son figure out his own problems instead of rushing to solve them for him? "It feels terrifying," I admitted. "And wonderful. Mostly wonderful." My phone buzzed with text messages, first from Archie, then from Iris, then from Sadie, who had apparently been recruited to guilt me into compliance. The messages started with confusion. "Mom, are you okay? Archie said you hung up on him." Escalated to irritation. "This is really selfish, Mom. Iris is stranded." And finally reached outright anger. "I can't believe you're being this difficult over such a simple request." I read each message, then deleted them without responding. Let them figure out how to solve their problem without me. Let them learn what it felt like when the person they'd taken for granted suddenly became unavailable. That night, I stood in my bathroom looking at myself in the mirror. Really looking, maybe for the first time in years. The woman staring back at me was 67 years old, with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She looked tired, but not defeated. Worn, but not broken. She looked like someone who had been through a lot but was still standing. She looked like someone who was ready for an adventure. I opened the medicine cabinet and took out the bottle of hair dye I'd bought the week before, a rich auburn that was close to my natural color from 30 years ago. Tomorrow, I would start becoming Alice Henderson, the woman who was going to spend 6 weeks sailing through the Mediterranean without a single thought for ungrateful children who had forgotten. That respect was a two-way street, but tonight, I was still Maeve Wood, and I had one final task to complete. I sat down at Jessie's old desk and began writing 3 letters, one for each of my children, and one for Eleanor Price, to be delivered after my ship had sailed. The letters would explain everything. Why I'd given away their inheritance, why I'd disappeared without warning, and why they would never see me again unless they learned to treat me like a human being instead of a servant. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I was going to celebrate the first time in 40 years that I'd put my own needs first, and it felt absolutely magnificent. The 6 weeks aboard the Mediterranean Empress turned out to be the most transformative period of my entire life. For the first time in 40 years, I woke up each morning with only one question: what would make me happy today? It was a question I'd forgotten how to ask. I'd booked a balcony stateroom under my maiden name, Alice Henderson, and from the moment I stepped aboard in Barcelona, I felt like I was shedding an old skin. The woman who had spent decades serving everyone else's needs was gone, replaced by someone I was still getting to know. Someone who could sit on her private balcony with morning coffee and watch the sunrise over the Mediterranean without checking her phone for demands from ungrateful children, because there were no demands. I'd left my phone in a drawer back in my Clearwater Heights apartment, along with a forwarding address for my mail and instructions for my landlord to donate any belongings. I didn't want a charity. The only people who knew how to reach me were Dorothy King and Eleanor Price, and both had strict instructions not to give out my contact information under any circumstances. For the first week, I felt guilty about the silence. Every morning, I'd catch myself reaching for a phone that wasn't there, wondering if Archie needed something, or if Sadie had some crisis that required my immediate attention. But by the second week, as we sailed from Barcelona to Monaco to Rome, the guilt faded into something much more precious: peace. I'd never realized how exhausting it was to constantly worry about other people's problems until I stopped doing it. The ship offered dozens of activities, and for the first time in my life, I could choose based purely on my own interests rather than what would be most useful to my family. I signed up for watercolor painting classes and discovered I had a natural talent for capturing the play of light on water. I joined a book club that met every afternoon on the upper deck, where we discussed novels I actually wanted to read instead of helping someone else with their homework or research. But the most surprising discovery was how much I enjoyed the company of other people when I wasn't serving them. At dinner each night, I rotated between different tables, getting to know fellow travelers who saw me as Alice Henderson, a woman with her own stories and opinions and sense of humor, rather than someone whose primary value was her willingness to solve problems and provide free labor. There was Margaret Foster, a retired teacher from Portland who'd taken the cruise to celebrate her divorce from a husband who'd taken her for granted for 30 years. There was Dr. James Richardson, a widowed cardiologist from Boston who'd learned to paint after his wife died and now traveled to sketch architecture in different cities. These people asked about my life, not because they needed something from me, but because they were genuinely interested in knowing me. When I told them I was recently widowed and rediscovering myself after years of focusing on family, they nodded with understanding rather than immediately asking what I could do for them. "It's never too late to start over," Margaret said one evening as we watched the sunset from the deck outside Naples. I was married for 35 years to a man who saw me as his personal assistant rather than his partner. Leaving him was the scariest thing I'd ever done, but also the most liberating. "How did you know it was time?" I asked, thinking about my own children and the phone call that had finally broken something irreparable inside me. When I realized that if I died tomorrow, he'd be upset about having to learn how to do his own laundry, not about losing me, she said with a sad smile. That's when I understood that I wasn't living my life. I was just maintaining his. Her words resonated so deeply that I felt tears prick my eyes. That's exactly what I'd been doing for 40 years. Maintaining other people's lives while forgetting to live my own. Dr. Richardson overheard our conversation and joined us at the railing. "My wife used to say that the most generous thing you can do for people you love is to live your own life fully," he said quietly. She believed that constantly sacrificing yourself doesn't actually help anyone. It just teaches them that your happiness doesn't matter. These conversations, happening as we sailed past ancient cities and islands that had witnessed thousands of years of human stories, helped me understand that what I'd done wasn't cruel or selfish. It was necessary. My children had learned to see my sacrifice as their right rather than my choice, and the only way to break that pattern was to stop participating in it. 3 weeks into the cruise, while we were docked in Santorini, I received my first communication from the outside world. Eleanor Price had arranged to send a message through the ship's communication center, letting me know that she'd delivered the news about the inheritance to my children exactly as planned. The message was brief. Estate transfer completed as requested. All parties have been notified. Children requesting your contact information. I have declined to provide it. Enjoy your voyage. EP. I read the message 3 times, sitting in the ship's library with a cup of tea and a view of the brilliant white buildings cascading down the volcanic cliffs of Santorini. My children now knew that their father's money was gone, donated to children who would never take it for granted. They knew I was the one who had made that decision, and they knew they couldn't reach me to demand explanations or attempt to manipulate me into changing my mind. Part of me expected to feel guilt or sadness about their shock and anger. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: relief. For 40 years, I'd carried the weight of their problems, their needs, their emotions. When Archie was stressed about work, I absorbed his anxiety. When Sadie was disappointed about something, I felt responsible for fixing it. When either of them was angry, I automatically assumed it was my fault and tried to make amends. But sitting in that library, surrounded by books and sunlight and the quiet conversations of people pursuing their own interests, I realized I didn't have to carry their emotions anymore. Their anger about the inheritance was their problem to solve, not mine to manage. That night at dinner, I told Margaret and Dr. Richardson about my decision to donate Jessie's estate to charity instead of leaving it to my children. I explained about the years of being taken for granted, the parking lot incident, and the phone call that had finally broken my tolerance for their treatment. I expected judgment or at least surprise, but instead, both of them nodded with understanding. "You gave them 40 years," Margaret said firmly. "If they hadn't learned to value you in all that time, more money wasn't going to teach them. Your husband worked hard for that money," Dr. Richardson added. "But I suspect he worked hard because he loved his family, not because he wanted to enable their selfishness. You honored his intentions by making sure the money went to people who would appreciate the sacrifice behind it." Their support meant more than I could express. For the first time since making my decision, I felt completely confident that I'd done the right thing. The remaining 3 weeks of the cruise passed in a blur of new experiences and growing confidence. I learned to order wine without worrying about the cost. I bought beautiful scarves and jewelry from local artisans in port cities, choosing things that made me happy rather than what would be practical or useful to others. I stayed up late talking with new friends and slept in without feeling guilty about wasted time. Most importantly, I started making plans for my future. Real plans that were about building a life I wanted rather than serving a life others had designed for me. By the time we docked in Barcelona for disembarkation, I had decided not to return to Clearwater Heights. Dr. Richardson had told me about a retirement community in Asheville, North Carolina, where his sister lived, a place that offered independent living with art studios, hiking trails, and a community of people who'd chosen to prioritize their own happiness in their later years. "It's not about age," he'd explained. "It's about deciding that you deserve to live somewhere beautiful, surrounded by people who see you as a whole person rather than just what you can do for them." That sounded exactly like what I needed. As I walked down the gangplank in Barcelona, carrying 2 suitcases and wearing a flowing dress I'd bought in Florence, I felt like a completely different person from the woman who had boarded 6 weeks earlier. Alice Henderson was confident, independent, and excited about the future. She had money in the bank, friends who valued her company, and most importantly, she had learned to value herself. The old Maeve Wood, who had spent 40 years apologizing for taking up space in the world, was gone forever. And I couldn't have been happier about it. 1 year later, I was sitting in the sunroom of my new apartment at Willowbrook Senior Living Community in Asheville, North Carolina, painting a watercolor of the Blue Ridge Mountains when Dorothy King called with news that made me set down my brush and laugh until tears ran down my cheeks. "Alice," she said, using the name I'd legally changed to 6 months earlier. "I thought you'd want to know what's been happening back in Clearwater Heights. My cousin works at Riverdale Community Bank, and the gossip has been, well, let's just say your former family has been having quite a year." I settled back in my comfortable chair, surrounded by my art supplies, my books, and the beautiful mountain view I woke up to every morning. "Tell me everything." What Dorothy told me was better than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. Apparently, the news of the inheritance donation had hit my children like a financial tsunami. They'd been so confident that Jesse's money would solve all their problems, that they'd already made plans based on their expected windfall. Archie and Iris had put an offer on a larger house in the exclusive Elmwood Estates neighborhood, assuming they'd have the cash for a substantial down payment. Sadie and Lemuel had booked a 3-week European vacation and put deposits down on several expensive experiences, planning to pay for it all once the estate was settled. The first sign of trouble came when Eleanor Price called them to her office for what they assumed would be a routine distribution meeting. Instead, they'd been handed copies of the charitable donation documents and informed that they would be inheriting exactly nothing except some furniture and personal items from my apartment. From what I heard, Dorothy continued, Archie actually fainted right there in the lawyer's office, hit the floor like a sack of potatoes. I tried to feel bad about that, but honestly, the image of my entitled son collapsing when he realized his free ride was over just made me smile wider. But here's the really interesting part, Dorothy went on. When they tried to contact you to demand an explanation, they discovered that your apartment had been cleared out, your lease terminated, and your phone disconnected. You'd vanished without a trace. The panic that followed, according to Dorothy's sources, had been epic. They'd called hospitals, thinking I might be ill or injured. They'd contacted the police, claiming I was a missing person, only to be told that adults had the right to relocate without informing their families. They'd even hired a private investigator who had traced my activities right up to the point where Alice Henderson boarded a cruise ship in Barcelona and then hit a dead end. The investigator told them you could be anywhere in the world by now, Dorothy said with obvious glee, living under a different name, completely untraceable, which was essentially true. I'd sold my Honda Civic and most of my belongings, donated clothes to charity, and used the proceeds, along with the money I'd kept from Jesse's life insurance, to start over completely. The apartment at Willowbrook was beautiful and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony overlooking the mountains. I'd furnished it with things I actually liked rather than hand-me-downs and practical choices. But the best part of Dorothy's update was what had happened to my children's carefully constructed lives once their financial safety net disappeared. Without the expected inheritance, Archie and Iris couldn't afford the house in Elmwood Estates. The sellers had kept their deposit when they backed out, and they'd been forced to take out a larger mortgage on a smaller house in a less desirable neighborhood. Archie had also been passed over for a promotion at work. Apparently, his assumption that he'd soon be financially independent had made him overconfident and demanding with his supervisors. And get this, Dorothy added, Iris had to get a job for the first time in her life. She's working part-time at a boutique in downtown Millfield, and according to my cousin, she complains constantly about having to be on her feet all day. The irony was delicious. Iris, who had treated me like hired help and mocked my simple lifestyle, was now learning what it felt like to work for someone else's convenience. Sadie and Lemuel's situation was even more dramatic. They'd not only lost the deposits on their European vacation, but had also been forced to borrow money from Lemuel's parents to avoid defaulting on their credit cards. The humiliation of having to ask for financial help, something they'd never had to do before thanks to my constant bailouts, had apparently caused serious strain in their marriage. Lemuel's mother made them move back into their starter home after they couldn't make the mortgage payments on the house you'd helped them buy, Dorothy reported. Word is that Sadie cries every time she has to drive through her old neighborhood. But the most satisfying news came at the end of Dorothy's call. They've been trying to find you for months, she said. Not because they're worried about you or sorry for how they treated you, but because they want to contest the donation. They've been to 3 different lawyers, trying to find a way to prove you weren't mentally competent when you made the decision. I laughed out loud at that. And every lawyer has told them the same thing. The documentation is ironclad. You worked with Eleanor Price for weeks, had multiple consultations, and clearly understood exactly what you were doing. Plus, the Children's Hospital Foundation has already used the money to fund a new pediatric wing, so even if there were grounds for a challenge, it would be impossible to recover. The pediatric wing. That detail filled me with more satisfaction than all the rest combined. Jesse's money earned through decades of hard work and sacrifice, was now saving the lives of children whose families couldn't afford medical care. Children who would grow up grateful for the second chance they'd been given, who would remember the kindness of strangers who had helped them in their darkest moments. Unlike my own children, who had taken 40 years of kindness for granted and never once said thank you. "There's one more thing," Dorothy said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "They've been telling people around town that you've lost your mind, that you were manipulated into giving away their inheritance. They're painting themselves as the victims of an elderly woman's mental breakdown." I considered this for a moment, looking out at the mountains where I hiked 3 times a week with my new friends from the art club. Last month, I'd had my first gallery showing of my watercolor paintings, selling 6 pieces to people who appreciated my work. I was healthier, happier, and more mentally sharp than I'd been in years. "Let them," I said finally. "Anyone who actually knows me will see through that story pretty quickly. And anyone who doesn't know me well enough to see through it isn't someone whose opinion matters." After I hung up with Dorothy, I sat in my sunroom for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. A year ago, I'd been a lonely widow sitting in parking lots while ungrateful children enjoyed lives I'd made possible. Now, I was Alice Henderson, an artist and adventurer who had friends who valued her company and a future full of possibilities. My children had lost $2.3 million, but they'd gained something far more valuable if they were smart enough to recognize it: the opportunity to learn what it meant to work for what they wanted, to appreciate what they had, and to treat the people who loved them with respect and gratitude. Whether they took advantage of that opportunity was up to them, but it was no longer my responsibility to manage their choices or cushion the consequences of their actions. That evening, I walked to the community center for my weekly book club meeting, carrying a thermos of the expensive coffee I'd learned to love during my cruise. As I settled into my chair among friends who knew me as Alice Henderson, a woman with interesting stories and strong opinions and a talent for watercolor landscapes, I felt nothing but gratitude for the night I'd been left sitting in a parking lot outside Bellingham Country Club. That humiliation had been the gift that finally set me free. My children had wanted to inherit their father's money. Instead, they'd inherited the most valuable lesson he could have given them: that love and respect must be earned, not demanded, and that taking people for granted eventually means losing them forever. Some lessons are expensive. This one had cost them $2.3 million, but for me, it had been worth every penny. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.